Now I'd like to turn it over to Jeff Gould for his presentation. It's all yours, Jeff.
Uh, Thank you, Bill Hoke, and thank you, New Vitae, for having me. I'm nothing less than honored to be here. I was honored to be asked. I've been excited about this event for a few months now. A little bit nervous. It's not a talk I've given before, but I do like a good challenge. And so I do want to say, I'm going to kind of give you some insight into who I am. I don't so much speak on it. I've been to a lot of CE, a lot of CEU over the years. I've done a lot of continued education. And I kind of marvel at the LPCs and the masters in education that could get up, tell you what study they read. Dr. Sally Leonard in 1996 published it, in the Addiction Journal. And I'm not going to be a guy. I speak in general impressions of things I picked up along the way, and there's some definite reasons for that. It pertains to the subject matter at hand. So I want to apologize if anything I say is off, or if maybe some of my ideologies and my thoughts on this subject matter maybe clash with your ideologies and what you think and believe. I actually think that's a good thing. I think two sides of 2 points of view is what makes for critical thinking and people that are studying subject matter. And so, if I'm a little off base, I just apologize for it ahead of time. I do want to open by saying I think what brings me here today. In November 22nd, I'll have 19 years sober, free from alcohol and alcoholism, heroin. And one of the things I've noticed in that tenure, people tend to gravitate towards the types of help they were given, right? So in the very beginning, some of the people I noticed would say, they got sober in 12-step, as I did. And then, well, I want to be a 12-step sponsor, right? And then a little bit later, you see people that say, well, I want to be a drug and alcohol counselor. I want to be an LCDC. And I've seen a lot of that. And then as we kind of moved into a transition period of the way people entered treatment, then in around the 2010, everybody wanted to be an interventionist, right? That's who came to their aid and rescue. I mean, there was one kid I remember working in adolescent treatment. His name was George. And George had enrolled himself in school to be a psych nurse. I mean, that was the person who made a difference in his life. What makes me in this position a little bit different is I'm not giving you this talk because of the help I was given. I'm giving you this talk because of the help I was not given, as a lot of people are not. I'll probably revisit this point again and again. This is a very underserved population. This is a very misunderstood population. This is a population that I think on some level, the stigma and the misattention, if somebody's in a wheelchair at the grocery store, it's very obvious visually to everyone that there's an impairment, that person is different from the rest of the people in a grocery store in a very specific way. But here we're talking about an injury. Maybe it is the only organ in our body that's encased 360 degrees by bone, so you can't see it. Sometimes you see the results of it, but oftentimes in our medical and treatment communities, we just think people are being difficult. Shape up, and I want to tell you, guilty as charged. I've worked in treatment for 18 years, and there were people that had limitations in the milieu that weren't getting the attention, the care. Well, we'll get into assessments and stuff in a little bit. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. To lay a little groundwork here, just to kind of, to get the talk moving in a forward direction. I was on Facebook recently, and there's a friend of mine, young guy, probably 7 years sober, really neat, dynamic personality, and he had shared an old post from his Facebook. He's got a little boy named Sawyer. Sawyer's probably 4 or 5 years old, and he and Sawyer had been doing a little roughhousing, and they both fallen backwards and fallen down a stair step or two, and Sawyer had landed on his forehead. And so he's sharing this old picture on Facebook of his kid with an injury about the size, it looked like about a half the size of a lemon on his little head. And he's saying, my boy is a tough kid, and I remember the day this happened. And he was just sharing, it was like sharing an old memory. And we raced to the emergency room. I was so worried, but he's a tough kid. And I called him up because he and I are friends. And I said, hey, could we talk about that Facebook post you posted? And I said, yeah. And I said, so what happened when you took to the hospital? And he started walking me through the process and walking me through the MRI and walking me through what was probably 125 minutes, right, of attention care before they give him clean bill of health. You're good to go. And one of the things I remember now, before I ruined my life at 25 due to acute, alcohol poisoning on a daily basis, I had gone into EMS. And one of the things I remember, a couple of things I remember, one of the things I remember, if you're surveying a scene with multiple patients, let's say there was a 3-car accident with multiple patients, the two things you're going to look for at the top of your criteria as you move treating patient to patient, you're looking for airway and arterial bleed in that order. But let's say there's multiple patients with airway and arterial bleed. Who do you go to first, ethically, right? And you always went to the pediatrics first. The younger they were, the quicker they got the attention because they have considerably the most life left to live. So from a medical standpoint, pediatric medicine in little kids, very, very important. So again, just to kind of nail down what we're talking about a 5-year-old kid with a clear visual injury on his head that goes into the emergency room, comes out 2 hours later, clean bill of health, right as rain. And I asked him, what's he been like since? And Ryan told me, he said he's very, very clingy. He was never like this before. Yeah, and he's got all kinds of emotional problems. He hits his sister. He cries a lot. He screams a lot. He can't seem to calm down, and he was never like that before. And I said, hey, are you open to the idea that there may be an underlying, there's something going on here that when you left the emergency room wasn't that apparent to you? And here's the funny thing, you guys, how is it that a heroin addict that spent, whatever, with 19 years clean, how is it that I'm the one pointing this out to him on Facebook? Like, hey, by the way, there's something going on here. It's clear as a bell to me, but that's, that's kind of the world we're living in. So I set him up with a couple of phone numbers and I said, hey, I want you to call these phone numbers and I want you to go get a scan and maybe they can illuminate a little bit better on what might be going on here. So I was kind of thinking, I took some notes in the last couple of days, and there was somebody who was something of a mentor to me in my life for about 7 years. And one of the things he used to tell me, he said, when a pickpocket meets a saint, all he sees is his pockets. And I don't know if any of you have ever sort of reached this point in your career where you begin to look at everything through the lens of like what it is you're passionate about. I've been there a lot lately with both the problem and the solution. The more I look, the more apparent to me the problems, not only in the industry, but the more I'm very in tune with TBI and what it looks like. There was a viral video that came out about 2 months ago. It's pretty widely broadcast on ESPN because it involved the quarterback from the Oklahoma Sooners, OU. I should know that. I live in Texas and they're the big rival, but anyway. And this quarterback was in a bathroom of some crowded bar at 9 o'clock at night. And, he had had a few drinks and the other guy had a few drinks, and they're doing what people who drink too much do. And they're getting into some guff and making a lot of nonsense. And this littler guy, who was a trained cage fighter, picked him up and just pretty much hurled him into the bathroom wall. And I was like, and you could almost count down the video to it. And 5, 4, 3, and there comes the life-changing incident right there on the bathroom floor of a bar, just from saying the wrong thing. And that the medical follow-up was, his orbital bone was cracked in half. And I was like, nobody's followed up with any more ESPN videos now, but I would bet he's not doing good. Matter of fact, his friend didn't look like he came out of that too okay either. So everywhere I look, I'm like kind of in tune with the problem. And then on the flip side of that, I'm a guy, the application of my work, and we'll talk about this later, I'm always looking for new ways to create kind of like mental gymnastics and brain puzzles. I was in an art store the other day, and I was looking at a big poster, I think, of Marvel superheroes. And I'm like, boy, could you make a memory quiz out of that deal, right? You show your identified patient this painting for 60 seconds, and then you flip it around and like, okay, the superhero jumping out in the top right, what did he have in his hand? And the first one jumping out at you, what was the emblem on his, just things like that. And so I'm always looking at life these days through the problem and the solution, and I'm always taking on new supervision, and I'm really intrigued by questions and some of the things I hear. I have a guy important to me in my life whose head hit the window a few years back, and he said, he said, it's the funniest thing. I go to drink a glass of orange juice and I taste coffee, right? I go to eat a steak and I taste like chocolate milk, and among the many other problems he has. And I was like, how is that like an endocrine, and those are the kinds of things where I'll stay up reading about that kind of stuff. I'm so intrigued by that kind of stuff. So I will share with you just a little bit about my story. I am the son of a West Point man who himself was the son of a West Point man. I come from higher academia in every sense of the world. About 3/4 of my adult family is PhD level or higher in academics. And, dad ended up being a nuclear weapons engineer. My oldest sister has about, she's got about 3 different doctorates, one in botany, one in, dinosaur bones, things like that. So I come from smart people, but I was a guy, and two kind of things I remember happening around the same time. One, I had developed that acute sensitivity that becomes the underlying condition of alcoholism, where it's an overconcentration of self, where it's like I feel like I know exactly what you think about me, and that's unfavorable. And I begin to live in a cage of what I think you think about me, right? And it feels like I just don't have the skin for it. It feels like everybody's reading my mail. And like a lot of other conditions, that would be found in the DSM-5, I'm sort of leaning towards being a fairly self-involved, miserable dude. What makes alcoholism different than all the other illnesses is I get a special effect with a drink of alcohol, to which is the cure to all those other things I'm feeling. So I kind of have that going on in right field. But out in left field, I was 11 years old, and me and my best friend, we were in a schoolyard, and I said, I bet I could jump my bicycle off that picnic table. He said, give it a shot. Put my bike up there, and once you get up there, you're looking down like, this looks a lot taller up here than what it did look like on the ground. You only got 6 feet of runway here. And you guys, I went over hat and hit my head on a rock, was knocked unconscious, woke up, and that was what I know now was that I had a slight case of what we would call Erland syndrome, right? I was very sensitive to light. I was always kind of squinting in photos after that. Sometimes you'll see words or letters kind of float off a page or float off a sign, things like that. And it was just a couple of years later, again, same friend, now I'm 13 years old. And for some reason, maybe they were doing a remodeling or something. He and I had talked about this and we couldn't quite pin it down. But one of the closet doors had been taken off its hinges, and he might have been reaching up in the closet for a magic set. I might have been laying on the ground reading a comic book, kid stuff. And his elbow had kind of upset that door, right? And that door started to topple and it came swinging down. And he told me to look out. And right as I turned to look, the corner of that door hit me in the face. And you talk about just maximum damage. I probably had $25,000 in maxillofacial surgery after that. I remember moving my tongue around in my mouth to an extremely unfamiliar landscape, because the teeth that were left, which was about half, were all pointed that way. Everything had just folded up against the roof of my mouth. And, there was a lot of stitches involved and a lot of, kind of wiring everything back into place, wiring my mouth shut, wiring my teeth back in, those kinds of things. And actually that was the least result of that injury, because it was shortly thereafter. I began to have very strong and morbid visions. I began to be terrorized by things, night terrors almost every night. And I don't think I had the wither to or the verbiage to describe what I was going through back then, but I do remember thinking I was possessed by the devil for about the next 8 years of my life. And the kinds of thoughts and the kinds of torment I was in, I knew intuitively. Again, we're going back to, oh, we got to be talking about 1981 maybe. And so I knew then, like, you can't talk about what's going on inside you. They're going to lock you in a padded cell if you do. And so I began living with this quiet and disturbing secret that I was very different, right? And I have a friend out in Los Angeles. He's a PhD, and one of the things my friend David Wiss likes to say is, like, but we're like a cat in some ways, where our eyes just adjust to the darkness very quickly, and before too long it seems like that's all we know, like it's the only life we've ever known. And I just adapted to that, and got drawn to subculture and dark things. And so no wonder that here I am, this bright kid that went to private school and went to Catholic school, and my dad was West Point and his dad was West Point, and everybody in my family's educated. And yeah, I ended up on the streets of Skid Row in Los Angeles. I ended up walking down the street. I remember one time I packed myself a little suitcase and made a phone call because I was going to try and get well. And if any of you are familiar with Van Buren Road in Phoenix, it's a most unsavory place. Every window on that road is broken, and there's garbage bags piled 50 feet high, and like there's people being taken away on gurneys off the street every day. And I had walked to this address, and I remember there was this giant sign that said "Rehabilitation starts here." And I walked up with my little suitcase and tapped on the glass, and a guard rolled down the window, and I said, "I'm here to be rehabilitated." And he said, "Son, this is This is La Alhambra State Prison, but the building you're looking for is right next door, right?" So those are the kinds of places I found myself going in. And Michelle, if you would pull up that scan again. So for those of you not familiar, there's going to be there's kind of 4 scans we look at when we talk about getting good imagery of TBI. The most obvious are going to be CT and MRI, which from what I've heard, MRI is actually the most unreliable. What it will tell you is if there's a vascular injury and if you have a bleed, it'll conclude that pretty quick. But overall wellness and longevity, or the long term, I think that's going to be the least indicative of where you're actually at. So the brain we're looking at, just so you know, this is SPECT imagery, which is, I'm not even going to try and pronounce it. But this is SPECT imagery, which is 3 cameras that measure blood flow and oxygenation. And so you can see from the right side of the scan, there's there's a little bit of a scalloping pattern and a couple of nasty dips. In the bottom right image, you can see that blunt, flat kind of hammerhead. Just so you know, the front of your brain on a scan is supposed to be round. It's not supposed to be flat like that, not like a hammerhead shark, and that is definitely indicative of traumatic brain injury. The left, again, you've got a couple of those nasty dips. I don't know what happened with those holes, but let's look at the upper left side. So I don't have a comparative scan to show you what this is supposed to look like. I only have a scan to show you what this absolutely is not supposed to look like. Those 2 holes, that's your prefrontal cortex. That's your body's executive manager that tells all the other parts of the brain what to do and where to do it. There's obviously a lack of good blood flow and oxygen. And then on the left and right side, that left temporal lobe, you can see it is obviously, and again, it's flipped around, so it's going to be on your right side, but there's obviously a lot of damage there, both parietal lobes, both temporal lobes, and you can drop that image back down, if you would, please, Michelle. And so, guys, the reason I show you that scan is because that's my brain. And that's not my brain 18 years ago when I sobered up. That's my brain 8 weeks ago when I got this scan, after having quit smoking, after having stopped drinking and doing narcotics 18 years ago. That's my brain after 18 years of good prefrontal cortex work, developing and in guided meditations and mantra meditations and visual meditations and drinking lots of water. And especially this past year, because I'm constantly providing interventions for other people, I participate in all those interventions as well. And that's what I guess what I'm saying is that's what I look like at my best. And all of that is undiagnosed brain trauma, everything you saw. And I've been in and out of facilities as long as I could remember. And so, one of the things, I'm going to go back to Facebook. So it's interesting. There's probably 5 or 6 pretty big like TBI, like support groups like TBI and Healthy Alternatives, TBI, Friends of TBI and Support Network. There's all these Facebook groups with tens of thousands of members, right? And up until recently, I was pretty quiet. I just like to watch and kind of observe the kinds of things people say. And one of the things that is so striking to me now, in paying attention, there's one guy, I really challenge this guy on something. Every day he says, #heals TBI. You know what I mean? And I sent him a message and I said, hey, I want to challenge you on something. One, I don't think that's true. But 2, maybe you could change your hashtag to THC helps TBI. And the reason I say that, and here's why, listen, I'm an abstinence-based recovery guy. That's what I believe in. I'm 12-step. That said, our medical fraternity has created this weird underground subculture of self-advocacy where people, for lack of any better direction, are like, well, I guess I'll just try smoking a bunch of pot and see if that helps me, because they're walking in and out of our emergency rooms and they're not really getting any real help. As a matter of fact, the things that seem to help you most, and some of you know this, somehow, well, they're not connected to big pharma companies. And listen, you guys, I'm not some conspiracy whack job here. Sometimes I think I feel like I'm in this murky underworld of studying alternative medicine because there's a lack of real answers going in and out of our emergency rooms, and people are all but left to fend for themselves. I was talking on the phone with a stuntman up in Boston, right? And the stuntman had fallen. He was on a film shoot. He had fallen off a scaffolding about 30 feet. He hit his head on a piece of steel on the way down. And when he finally gets to the ground and wakes up the next day, and there was definitely what he would describe as a displacement of self. He said it felt like somebody or something else was in my body animating me. And my first response to that stimuli was I wanted to commit suicide, right? So he asked somebody, what do I do? And they say, go to hyperbaric chamber, which, by the way, is, I think good oxygenated blood flow is the name of the game for many, many different interventions. And I'll come back to that. But anyway, he goes to hyperbaric, and he didn't do his full round. He's about 10 sessions in, not helping him at all. And so he gets on the internet and he finds out about this thing called TMS, transmagnetic stimulation. And that's in San Diego. And so he says, heck, I think I'll drive there. Quits the film, packs everything into the Volvo, drives from Boston to San Diego, and goes and does 3 or 4 sessions and gets some relief. Is living at a beach house doing TMS. And there was no one there, including the hyperbaric oxygen people, to kind of guide and shape a treatment plan and tell him, buddy, you don't have to drive to San Diego to look for a different alternative here to get some real help. But there was nobody sort of guiding and shaping that process. So sometimes people have no one to advocate for themselves but the internet itself, which, I mean, I think that speaks for itself. Like, who knows what you're going to find, right? And so I began to notice, we kind of live in a world of fast-moving objects, agreed? And if you guys remember this from your high school science class, we have this this very delicate instrument that forever is going to shape the way we think, and it's going to shape the way we feel. And we have this delicate instrument housed inside this skull with all these razor-sharp bony edges that, as it turns out, weren't meant to like weren't meant to hit a windshield going 90 miles an hour, certainly weren't meant to put on a helmet and crash into each other all day long. Like our brains were not designed for that. That said, it's something we do anyway, and we seem to live in a world of fast moving objects. And so I'm going to tell you something here and now. I've worked in I worked in a facility, in treatment facility, good treatment facilities. I'm not going to name them. And I have seen in all our screenings and all our assessments, and I have yet to see in our facility or any other facility. I'm on the phone regularly when I intervene on patients, or we're at the airport or we're in the car ride. I have them on speakerphone as I listen to them be screened and assessed into the best of the best hospitals. And I have yet to hear one single person on that question ask anything about a TBI or ask a secondary question. Have you ever been hit in the head with a fast moving object? Never heard that. If I were to hear that question, and I'm going to make a number up, but it's what I believe, I would say as many as 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 would definitively answer yes. Alcoholics, it would be hard to determine because sometimes they're not coherent, when they fall down a flight of stairs or those kinds of things. But I would, again, I'm just going to guess at it. I would say as many as 1 in 10, it would be a definitive yes, which leads to, if we're telling the truth, because now we have a comorbidity, cause and effect, chicken and egg thing. Is this causing that, And so we have a comorbidity that's gone undetected through the screening process, of which the alcoholism itself or the alcohol abuse might be a symptom. And if you're not looking at what's driving and causing that symptom, you're never going to get to the bottom of it. I've been talking to some good endocrinologists. Some of you may know this, some may not. In about 33% of TBI cases, your endocrine system is going to be the culprit for a lot of problems, right? You've got that pituitary gland in the middle of your brain in a very vulnerable spot. And I like to explain things to families I'm working with in very easy and basic terms, not so that they can understand them, so I can understand them. I was thinking this morning, I wish they had a Google Translate. So when you're reading peer-reviewed medical journals, you could kind of copy and paste into Google Translate and like, hey, what does that mean in regular person language? Because I ain't a doctor, you know what I mean? Anyway, how I described that to families is I say, picture a post office, right? And every day this post office sends out a million little pieces of mail all over the city. These pieces of mail are called neurotransmitters. They're hormones. It tells your toenails what to do and your fingernails what to do and your skin what to do. And it's the way your brain communicates with your organs. Now picture a Greyhound bus crashing into the post office. And there's paper flying all around through the air, and that some of the mails got slowed and some of the mails got stopped. And that's what happens in about 33% of TBI patients. And guess what? If your hormones are off, you ain't gonna feel well. You're not gonna think well, you're not gonna feel well. You're either gonna be sad or you're gonna be angry or you're gonna be both all the time. I think it's and I don't know nothing about this experience, but I think it's almost like for anybody, a man or woman, having PMS, but permanently. And so we're going to send them to our addictionologist, who's going to may not even help because that's not their problem, right? And we're going to try and talk them out of it. And it's basically a setup for leaving against medical advice or leaving ASA, AMA, whatever your terminology wants to be. Because again, and it's such an easy problem to solve, but there's no education around it and there's no attention given to it, little or none, right? And so we have this billion-dollar industry, and I'm going to say as many as 1 in 10 patients have a comorbidity that we're not even looking for. Now let's flip to the other side of the thing. Let's flip to neuropsych, right? Concussion stuff. There was one of the big practices. I'm not going to name them here in this talk, but it's a big practice in Dallas. And I was chatting it up, getting friendly with the staff, and I said, hey, let me ask you a question. Theoretically, if one of your patients in their screening says, I take about 10 Xanax a day. No, I don't get them from the doctor. I score them off the street. And on the weekend, I drink a handle of vodka. I said, what would you do with that patient? And they said, we don't take them. And I said, good, I get that you don't take them or you can't take them, but what do you do with the patient? Where's the referral made? What's the call? And they said, we don't do anything. We just tell them, sorry, can't help you. So I want to revisit going back to my friend's child, Sawyer, the 5-year-old. Rather than giving him an MRI and a clean bill of health, how hard would it have been to say, here's what I want you to keep your eye out for. If you start seeing emotional problems in the next 6 to 8 weeks, if you start appearing what seems to be a 5-year-old version of brain fog in 6 to 8 weeks, although he was very, very little, if on some level his academics, his learning mobility as a 5-year-old child, if that crashes, hey, you need a QEG, you need to go see a specialist. That how hard is it to just have that conversation, to give somebody some basic information like we've given him an MRI, but that's not conclusive. If anything, it's inconclusive, right? Keep an eye on your kid, right? If something's different, like I don't think that's asking too much. I don't think it would be asking too much of our people that provide HBOT, that provide neurofeedback, that provide biofeedback, to familiarize themselves with all the other disciplines. That way, if what you're doing is not working, you guys, I think we're talking about a category of people who the risk of suicide is absolutely off the chart. There's a couple of studies. I was at Hanley Center, who, I'm going to give, I think right behind New Vitae, Hanley Center would be my go-to if I had to put somebody with TBI inpatient. I mean, they do it. There's a lot of people that have some of the features, kind of some of the bells and whistles of what could be a good TBI program, but let's tell the truth. They're just bells and whistles. Hanley Center does it well. Cognitive FX does it really well. New Vitae is excellent. Those would be my top 3, maybe actually in reverse order of the way I listed them. But so, in a perfect world, I think we would have mandatory follow-ups. I think in a perfect world, and I mean, we could do another whole hour on what insurance is and isn't willing to cover. It seems to be guided by pharmaceuticals on that. I think we could all agree. If you have a muscle tear in your hip or in your shoulder or something like that, do you know your insurance will cover all your hyperbaric oxygen treatment? That's just your arm. If you have TBI, good luck with that. If you're extremely lucky, you might be in the 5% of the people that can beg and plead your insurance to get a single payer case agreement. Otherwise, you're not getting any help at all. And I was thinking about this a couple of weeks ago. I mean, oxygen-rich blood flow is the name of the game in almost any treatment worth its weight in salt. As an example, we have a functional medicine nutritionist. She does 2 things. She helps build a nutrition plan that rebuilds myelin sheath that coatings over nerve endings. But what she really does is help people put together a diet of foods with anti-inflammatory properties. Why are you trying to bring down inflammation? So you can get oxygen-rich blood flow to the parts of the brain that aren't getting it. When we're talking about TMS or something like that, why are we using mild electric stimulation to certain parts of the brain? So we can get oxygen-rich blood flow to the parts of the brain that aren't getting it. And a lot of things seem to revolve around that basic principle of healing. So I'm going to tell you, and I think I'm going to land right on time of where I wanted to. I have worked in the field of addiction and behavioral health for going on 18 years. A lot of that was spent in a transitional living or extended care capacity. I worked in adolescent treatment for about 8 years. I've worked with some Vietnam vets. I was trained by a guy named Ed Storty to do interventions. And I always seem to get these really rich and complicated cases with really dynamic family systems behind them and a lot going on, which has helped kind of sharpen me as a provider. And it wasn't until these last several years, especially after I wrote the book about 3 years ago, I had really really started digging into, really reading a lot about, TBI and just wanting to get my facts straight, especially right before going to publish. I was like, this has to be, I want this book to go in unchallenged in terms of being, while it's a memoir, any mention I made of science, I wanted it to be right and I wanted it to be accurate. And so out of that, again, I began paying attention to the kinds of people I would see in the milieus. And, sometimes I would see these guys and sometimes their hygiene wasn't great and they seemed to stare off into space a lot. And, they were never very good at their chores. And uh, as a result of their strange affect, sometimes the guys would gang up on them and bully on them, and you would go look at their chart. And sure enough, they were in a motorcycle accident 3 years ago, had about 50 staples in their head, and there was no provision of any resource to treat the comorbidity, the other half of that. And I'm talking about good treatment centers. I called one of the big brands in Colorado and I said, hey, what do you do for this type of patient? They said, well, we stick them with a sober coach, ancillary cost. And that coach, helps them with their laundry and helps them learn how to balance their checkbook and all those things. And I asked them, and they said, but if we're telling the truth, they don't know anything about cognitive repair either. And so, and there's a very good PhD doctor from Southern California that's worked extensively with the National Hockey League, and this functional medicine nutritionist started putting together a coaching program that involves nutrition. It involves lots of puzzles. It involves lots of, well, I'll just give you an example. I work with a girl. I work with a number of people every week. I'm working with a girl. She was hospitalized 15 times. She ran out into the middle of Interstate 35 in a blackout. She was struck by a pickup truck. She flipped over the barrier of the rearview mirror of an 18-wheeler. Was struck her again in the back of the head. She was comatose for about 5 weeks. Came out, was in a specialized school to learn how to talk and how to drive and how to read. And she ASA'd from that school and went back to her life of living in hotel rooms, drinking in and out of program. And so she and I work together multiple times a week. There's a visualized prayer I have her, or a visualized meditation, I have her do every day. I've built her 2 set lists of neurological music therapy that really kind of stimulate the prefrontal cortex every day. So she's got her racquetball. She throws with the left, catches with the right, throws with the right, catches with the left, throws with the left, catches with the right, 200 times per day. I have I just printed 50 more. I started working with Japanese kanji, teaching her the basics of speaking Japanese, enough to get by in an airport probably. It's not really about going to Japan or speaking Japanese. It's about assigning meaning and recognition to shapes and things she's never seen before and pulling those into short-term memory. And so she got so good at it. Now we played speed chess and we do that. That's how we spend our Tuesday and Thursday mornings together. And then, she sees our nutritionist once a week. And sometimes you got to start very basic with people. Sometimes I say 3 colors per plate and brown and gray don't count as a color. You know what I mean? And so sometimes you just got to start very basic with people. My business partner, Brian Percox, is a family coach. And actually if any of you guys have seen, there's a new Pro Football Hall of Fame behavioral health. It's been all over the news. It came out of the NFL as a response to some of the suicides and tragedies they're seeing there. That's kind of his day job. And he's enrolled treatment centers in a behavioral health network, and they're doing a lot of great work, both in the football community and addiction community. And so he and I share a website, and we share a love intervention. Michelle, if you wanted to bring up our one sheet, if you have it. Let's see. So we share. This is our one sheet, labor of love intervention. We do some drug and alcohol intervention work. We do crisis and trauma counseling. We do a lot of family support. And then we do, and it's very much its own thing, we do TBI coaching, which is kind of everything I've learned from self-advocacy in 18 years or so. kind of condensed into, about 6 months of coaching where I'll help them build a treatment plan. The first thing we do is we get them a QEEG scan and we get a full blood workup to see if there's any problem with their hormones. And then out of their scan, I build a series of interventions. Again, it's some of the basic things we talked about. And I just kind of walk alongside them and shepherd them towards long-term wellness. Sometimes there's some life skills, sometimes there's some motivational interviewing, and sometimes there's just some basic grief counseling, in the sense that people that have had real TBI, I think there's a grief process when it's like, hey, come to find out you're not the person you used to be, and you may never be again, if we're telling the truth. But just like I had to, we all have to play the cards we were dealt and do the best with what we were given. You know what I mean? And if you're willing to do certain things, I believe you can get better. And so I hope, until the curtain calls for me, I'm always going to advocate for this patient and lead as many people to wellness as I can. And so that's it, guys. I think I landed, Bill, I think I landed right on the mark of where I hope to. I hope that made sense. Again, it's a talk I've never tried to give before, but I'm really nothing less than honored to be here. And thanks for letting me share, and we'll open it up to questions. So.
Thank you, Jeff. That was very informative. Does anyone have any questions for Jeff? You can unmute yourself.
I'm trying to think of a question, Jeff, but all I can say is that this was unbelievably informative, and I'm just so impressed with what you're doing with your life and how you're changing other people's lives. Thank you.
I really appreciate the comments. Thank you.
I have a question, Jeff. I was wondering, you showed us some scans of your brain and the notable prefrontal lobe damage. And I'm so curious to see, I mean, as you're talking and speaking, I see no evidence of executive function dysfunction. So what did you do for yourself?
Well, so I did, when I sobered up by year 2, I could not even speak in complete sentences. I was working with some folks, and I might walk up to you and be like, there's something regarding patient Smith. And I think, you know what I think? And then I would just walk off, and they even had a term for it around the office. People say, oh, he's just pulling another Jeff Gould. Jeff Gould's just being a Jeff Gould. And it was like I wasn't able to come. It was like thoughts would be flying through the air, and I'd have to try and grab them, And so they tried me, a psychiatrist tried me on Strattera, and that stimulant effect was not serving me at all. And so there was a guy, but this was, I think, pre-neurofeedback, but biofeedback was a thing. And he had a little setup in his house with a shower cap and a little handheld video game. And I did that for about 8 months, and that seemed to straighten that out. And then going into about year 10, and this is really more of a trauma thing, but I think it did have some effect on, there's parts of my story I did not share with you that are pretty horrific, and just living stuff. And by the time I was 10 years sober, I was really sensitive to touch. Sometimes my wife would run her hand down my arm like that, like people do, intimacy. And it felt like somebody dumped a basket of cobras in my lap, and I would jump back and be like, hey, like, don't touch me. You know what I mean? And I knew, like, this isn't good. And so I was talking to a professional in Denver, and I got set up again in somebody's living room doing EMDR for 10 to 12 weeks, which, by the way, if you didn't know, EMDR without a visual stimulus is a great go-to in right after a TBI. The other great go-to, and this is in Oslo and Norway and Berlin and that area of like upper northwest Europe, classical music is the go-to after a car accident. Your brain interprets those things as math. And so it actually, again, oxygen-rich blood flow, and it's getting all these wheels turning at the same time. Even for comatose patients, it's the go-to. We don't use it here. I'm not sure why not. And so I've done a little bit of a lot of things. I will take your commentary as a compliment. If you were to spend, I'm pretty focused and dialed in right now talking with you, but if you were to spend a week with me, a good friend of mine, Brandon, Brandon, he said, you look puzzled about half the time. And I was like, buddy, I've been puzzled for 32 years. Man, sometimes I have a blank stare. And some of my good friends, they're like, sometimes you have a very strange affect, Jeff. And I think that's the other side of what you're not seeing here, that if you were to notice it, you would be like, what's wrong with that dude? You know what I mean? And what's wrong with me is I've just still have inherited some damage that's 36 years old now, but it's there nonetheless. So,
Well, it's very commendable what you've done.
thank you.
So with some
Jeff,
of the,
yeah, Jeff, my name is Bill Liner. I just have a question. You briefly referenced diet and also managing inflammation. Can you say a few words about that?
I absolutely can. I think if we're going to be well, and I'm kind of picturing a guy that's living in mom's and dad's basement in a dark room that's heating up Tostino's pizza rolls in the oven and chugging a 2 liter of squirt, or Coca-Cola or whatever, or root beer. You guys, that ain't the recipe to wellness on any level. And so it's kind of hard. And that's where motivational interviewing comes in, because it's like, I believe food is probably the biggest, food and nutrition is probably the biggest intervention, not only on TBI, but on a number of things that you could possibly introduce to yourself, but you're fighting against 30 years of, old habits die hard and stuff. But our functional medicine nutritionist, she does some work for Wellevate. That's her day job. And in the evenings, she works with us, and she's, again, anti-inflammatory properties. And again, I probably explain things in a little bit too basic of a terms, but the things, if your ankle was irritated or your knee or your shoulder was irritated, you might see a little swelling, you might see a little redness, you might feel a little pain, you might feel a little, and while I think it's possible to have headaches, when your brain is irritated, it doesn't show up like any other thing. It shows up as brain fog. It shows up as, why can't you guys be quiet? I can't think, like it shows up as like that in traffic, right? And that's the thing, I think, again, you see this, you don't really see the injury, you just see the symptoms that one would associate with it. And I believe, like, right now, fish is 85% of my protein in my diet. I try and eat no less than 15 fruits and vegetables a day in my food log, and drink a ton of water. Because without those things, here's the truth, without those things, I have a brain fog so thick, I can't even do my job half the time. Like I said, I just shared with the other question, I definitely have cognitive limitations in this life. And if I'm not doing everything I can to circumvent that stuff, it's going to show up. It's going to show up in my life. So I love, I think food is going to have one or two properties. Either it's going to be loaded with sugar and it's going to cause inflammation, or it's going to be very plant-based, preferably above ground, growing plants as opposed to below ground. And, I'll say one last thing on it. I had a full knee replacement last, February, and any of you guys that have had one of those know that, like, it's a freaking bloodbath, man. But on the days I had drank cranberry juice and had a chicken salad, I would notice, just my level of pain would be the same. But I would notice if I had a quesadilla or something, or a bunch of corn chips and salsa and a quesadilla and a cheese sandwich, my bandages would get so tight on that leg. And visually, you could see the inflammation happen. It was like it would swell up to 4 centimeters bigger than it was supposed to be. And the pain would just be off the chart. And, your body is an entire ecosystem. So what's happening to my knee is also happening to my brain, and vice versa, because it's all part of the same system. So I don't know if that helped or not, but that would be how I would explain it. So.
Thank you, Jeff. I agree with you in the inflammation in the food. I have a question. It was a follow-up related to your reference to EMDR, and it works for TBI without a visual. And then you mentioned some other afflictions that it worked on, and was that without a visual also? And what exactly did you mean by that?
Well, so Rebecca DeLuke-Hogg is the LPC that's on our team. Rebecca's our Labor of Love is a team of 5, and she's the one that introduced me to the idea that EMDR without visual stimulation can be really effective in both TBI or trauma, which means that no glasses with the funny lights, right? You either have to rely exclusively on sound on the headphones, left, right, or you would have to have some kind of like a sheath you put over your finger that would vibrate, again, just giving you that bilateral thing. And so she's the one that introduced me to that. And I do think she sent me a study a while back. I don't remember exactly all what it said. The EMDR for me, you know, again, I went to the source of it for trauma, but it seemed like it cleared up a good number of things. I remember I had about 16 targets, and some of them were really, you know, among other things, you guys, I had my right hand cut off in a car accident. I had my arm out the window when I was 19. I had my right hand cut off in a car accident, was sewed back on. And I just had grinding PTSD. Every time I got in a moving vehicle, it felt like you have those dreams of like falling. It felt like that, but horizontally. And I was just in this, I really struggle with that after years. And there was about 6 other things that had an equal veracity to them that were just troubling to me. And the EMDR cleared a lot of that up. And I like to think it just, you know, some of that bilateral processing stuff, it helped me move through a lot of the trouble I was having. I remember, I think it might have been in June that year, this would have been about 2013, 2014, somebody came up at an AA meeting and they gave me a hug. And it felt like the first hug I'd ever received in my life. It felt like, like that's really warm and really good. Like I'm digging that. And that had not been my experience with human contact prior to that. It just wasn't something I cared for. So.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Very, very informative. Appreciate your sharing.
Yeah. I think this is a pretty quick question, Jeff. You had talked about a lot of these interventions of having a great influence in oxygenating the brain. So do you see or do you have any knowledge about the applicability with non-traumatic brain injuries, CVAs and strokes,
You know, again, I think here's where I get hung up, and just so you know, and this is always my, I think it's an ethical challenge. So I'm a TBI coach. Technically, I don't even use my license to do what I do, which allows me to travel across straight lines. And while I know a great deal about medicine, when I'm talking to my families, I'm like, what I'm going to do is provide a bunch of instruments and interventions that your loved one is going to kind of self there. And I'm going to give them a Hibbs 17 scale or some variation of it, to where they're going to monitor and self-report their own progress. That's what we're doing. We can get a follow-up QEG, but I say that, and it's important for me to say that because I never want to overstep my boundaries, right? And the truth is most of this stuff is still considered, from an insurance point of view, experimental medicine. So here's what I tell the people I work with. There's nothing I'm going to do that's going to hurt you. Now, there might be a great deal of things I'm going to do that's not going to help you at all, but you bouncing a racquetball off a wall 200 times a day is not going to hurt you. Meditation and visualized meditation never hurt anybody on the planet. There might be schizophrenia and people with insight-based trouble that's going to make them more mixed up, but that's not the population I work with, right? So learning some new languages, working on memory stuff, all I'm helping to do, I think of myself as the software guy. We're going to try and build some new neural pathways and little bridges, right, through the left and right side that maybe weren't there before. We're going to try and clear up some of that brain fog. At a minimum, I'm going to make you a healthier, more interesting person, right? And the other thing I tell people, and this has been my experience, I said, for every 5 things I mentioned, you may only pick up 1 or 2 of them. I mean, from over a duration of time, but those 1 or 2 little suggestions might change your life, right? So if I recommend you do 10 things and you pick up 4 of them, those 4 things might change your life. You know, if I recommend 20 things over the course of a considerable period of time and you start eating better, I heard something the other day that blew my mind. You know, if anybody else likes science fiction movies, Back to the Future or something like that, there's this common theme of science fiction movies that if you go back in time in a time machine, you don't want to tinker around with too much stuff because it might screw up the future, right? And we could all buy into that and be like, yeah, you know, that sounds reasonable. And yet we never stop to apply that same logic to what we're doing right now. And I don't mean in a movie, in actual life, what we're doing here and now. What we do with our days and with our patients, it matters, trust me, because over a long trajectory, it's going to shape the arc of their life, hopefully towards wellness, if you give them enough information and enough motivational interviewing to get them to grasp onto some stuff, get them to, you know, grasp onto a little bit better. I really believe executive functioning, you know, what's the difference between 96 and 98% executive functioning, right? I'm just kind of throwing a number out there. I really believe that's, and I'm just based on my own life, that's the difference between going to college and living under a bridge. I'll tell you what, I've done both. The little things that we do matter here. I really believe that. And so again, I just try and shepherd and walk alongside people and show them things and help them grasp things and grasp new disciplines that they probably didn't even think they have a shot at, and then look back 4 weeks later and just ask them. So if, you know, give them a hip scale. So how you feeling? I would imagine you're feeling better, right? Just like I was. Anyway.
Thank you very much. That's helpful. I did see something come up in the chat box. Comfort was asking, did you ever utilize TMS treatment during your recovery?
I have not. I have not. Is it something I've recommended? Yeah. I'm a big believer in that.
Thank you.
Sorry, Jeff, this is Comfort. I was with a client. That's why I couldn't ask myself. But we do have some residents that kind of like pushing and families that are looking more into that. So I just wanted to get more information to see if it is helpful, or, you know, with the population that we have here too as well. Thank you.
All right, Jeff. Well, we're spilled over a little bit on time, but I, again, greatly appreciate your time today, the very useful information that you've shared with us on behalf of our, the Vitae Wellness Foundation. And again, if anyone needs to contact Jeff, he had his contact information. Michelle had it up earlier. You can contact us here at, you can reach out to Jeff through Labor of Love intervention, or you can contact me or one of our other team here at New Vitae, and we can help make that connection. But again, on behalf of the New Vitae Wellness Foundation, thank you all for joining us today.
Could I really double check the attendance? I think some people joined us late.